Speak again the ancient oaths, life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination. I'm Shawn.
I'm Mango.
And this is Speak the Words, a podcast where I try to explain the story of the Stormlight Archives to Mango 40 minutes at a time. Mango.
Yes.
What do you remember from last week?
I remember that there was this kid, I forgot his name. He joined this unit of the army, and they had to go fight over a land dispute or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And lots of people died. The kid died.
Yeah.
And Kaladin tried to murder some Light Eye guy, and then flash forward to 8 months later, Kaladin is a slave and is being transported, and he became a slave because he tried to kill the Light Eyes and failed, apparently. And he sees this little wind sprite thing, and he's like, yo, what the heck, why are you intelligent enough to use my name and talk to me? And it doesn't tell him. And then he tries to save this sick man, and instead the sick man just dies. And Kaladin's like, yo, what the fuck? You could have saved him. And Kaladin is very
murdered.
depressed. Yeah.
Yes, he is.
He's murdered.
The sick man specifically is murdered. Kaladin tells the slavers, this is what you can do to help him. And they just are like, okay. And they pull him off to the side and just break his head open. So.
Yeah. And then the next chapter, we start off with, I forgot her name.
Shallan is her name.
Shallan. And she's like redhead and sassy.
Yes.
And she's, I forgot the name of the country, but the ones that have the safe hand glove thing. And she just arrived in this city on a ship, and I don't remember anything else.
Okay. So, with Shallan, she's from the country of Yakaved, but the safe hand is a Vorin tradition. So I'll just... Vorin is religion. Yakaved is the country she's from, but her religion is the Vorin religion. So anybody who practices the Vorin faith wears a safe hand, if they're a woman, of course. Not necessarily bound to countries. And she's in this city. The city is named Kharbranth, and she's in this city to find Jasnah Kholin, who is the princess.
You didn't say that she was a princess last time.
Did I not say that she's the princess?
You did not. I would have remembered
she is
the princess.
So, Jasnah's the princess. Jasnah was first mentioned in the prologue. Szeth mentions her as being King Gavilar's daughter. But yes, it is. Jasnah is the princess. She's.
You did. Okay, you might have mentioned her in the prologue, but I don't remember any of the names from the prologue except for Szeth.
Yeah, which is fine. I
wouldn't have remembered that.
As that is why I'm here, so that as we go through it, I can remind you of things. Jasnah is the sister of the king, because her brother would have become king once Gavilar died, and her brother's name is Elokar.
Okay.
But that's not really important to this. But just, I have all these names stuck in my head and I can't get them out, so now you do too.
In one ear, out the other, but let's go.
Yes. All right. One other thing I wanted to bring up, just because I was thinking about it while I was editing last week's episode. I asked you at the end about the spren, and I just want to reiterate that what I meant at the end is that you don't need to remember the names of the spren, what they look like, but just keep the concept of spren in mind as we go along.
Okay.
while I was listening to it, I was like, I feel like I'm kind of coming across as if saying, like, you need to remember these spren. I do not remember what the spren that I described earlier in this podcast look like. It is not important what they look like. It's neat, but you don't need to remember what they look like. Just, I bring them up, because they are important in their own way. So, you ready to get some more Stormlight explanations?
Sure.
All right, my time begins in 3, 2, 1, now. So we left off, Shallan was in a cart being pulled up Carbaranth to the conclave at the top of the city, and now the cart has arrived at a giant building at the top of the city, which is the conclave, and the conclave is built into the rock itself. Remember I said that the city is built into this giant rock formation in like a wedge shape, and so the conclave at the top is built into the top of the mountain. Mm-hmm. The cart driver offers to pay Yalb, who is the person that was assisting her, if he lets the driver inflate the cost of the trip. And Yalb is like, he tells Shallan what he's saying. He's like, he's trying to cheat you. And last week I explained what Roshar looks like and what the people of Roshar look like. Now, really quickly, I'm going to explain the economy of Roshar, and then we're never going to talk about it again. So, the currency are spheres, and each sphere is a glass bead, a little larger than a person's thumbnail, with a much smaller gemstone set at the center. So it's a gemstone surrounded by glass. The gemstones in the center absorb stormlight, which make the spheres glow. Diamond chips are the smallest denomination. So diamond being the gemstone and chip being the size of the sphere. Emeralds are the most valuable gemstone, as they can be used by soul casters to create food. And like I said, the glass part, the actual size of the sphere... Oh no, I have that backwards. This is a good thing I did this. The glass, all spheres are the same size. It's the size of the gemstone that determines its worth. So the bigger the gemstone in the center, the more that sphere itself is worth. And also just, I think this is an interesting little note. Infused spheres that are already glowing with gemstones, are considered to be more reliable, and done ones might be, so ones that aren't glowing with stormlight, might be inspected as people think that maybe you're trying to pass off a fake gemstone to them.
Can the spheres break since they're glass?
Yes.
Does that make them worthless as currency?
I would assume so. I'd assume you could just set the gemstone at the center back into a new,
I guess,
like glass casing.
But until then, it would not be able to be used as currency.
I think it would. It never comes up. All
right.
I would presume so.
If it's made out of glass, you would think that it would come up eventually, that it could break, but never mind.
I don't know if they might, spheres might break at certain points, but I don't think they ever address, like, now, does that make it lose its value? I don't think they ever, like, directly address that. But also, it's 4,000 pages of book, so they might have said it at some point, and I've just forgotten.
I'm thinking too much.
Regardless, that's how they pay for stuff. Spheres, which are little circles of glass with gemstones at the center. So Shallan pays the porter, the person that carried her, and then she then pays Yalb for his help and for him to wait for her for a few hours. He says, all right, yeah, I'll wait here. You're paying me, sure. And she goes into the conclave. She found a master servant and told him that she was looking for Jasnah Kholin, and he sets off to find her. And while Shallan is left alone, she does a little thinking about religion, and she kind of explains the Vorin belief a little bit more, and she talks about how one's calling, so their profession, is like one of the most important aspects of Vorin belief. Doing a good job in your work ensured good placement in the afterlife. And the specific devotary that one visited was related to their profession. Shallan had wanted to choose art as her calling, but found natural history to be more in line with what she wanted, as she enjoyed studying. and that's why she wanted to become a great scholar, which is why she'd suggested the plan of seeking out Jasnah Kholin and becoming her ward, although that was only step one of her plan. The Master Servant has not yet returned, and Shallan thinks about Kharbranth, the city itself, for a second, and one book claimed that Kharbranth had been founded back in the Shadow Days, years before the Last Desolation, thousands of years old, created before the terrors of the hierocracy, long before the Recreants. And I'm not going to explain what those words mean.
Good.
But they'll be important later. The Master Servant returned and led Shallan away. Shallan got nervous as they walked about how to approach Jasnah. Everyone had heard of the Alethi king's brilliant heretic sister. Jasnah was only 34 years old, yet many felt she'd have obtained the cap of a master scholar if it weren't for her vocal denunciations of religion. Shallan couldn't be improper. Wardship to a woman of great renown was the best way to learn the feminine arts, which include music, painting, writing, logic, and science. So in this religion, they split arts between feminine and masculine.
Yep.
Shallan hadn't expected Jasnah to reply to her letter asking to become Jasnah's ward, and Jasnah had told her to meet her in Dumadari in 2 weeks. And that was 6 months ago. Shallan has been chasing her ever since. Whenever she gets to where Jasnah tells her she's gonna be, Jasnah's already left. Shallan wondered if Jasnah would demand that she renounce her faith in order to take her on as her ward. They stopped at a corridor, and Shallan heard voices from up ahead. She wondered how she ended up being the one with the hopes of her entire house on her shoulders. Their father was dead, and it was vital that remain a secret. She didn't like to think of that day. She all but blocked it from her mind. She trained herself to think of other things. House Devar owed great amounts of money to a great number of people, and without her father to keep them all appeased, the creditors would soon begin making demands. Her family was hated by its allies because of her father. Preventing that depended on Shallan, and the first step came with Jasnah Kholin. Shallan took a deep breath and strode around the corner, and then Chapter 3 ends. Chapter 4 is titled The Shattered Plains, and it has Kaladin's symbol, so we're back to Kaladin. The epigraph for this chapter is, "I'm dying, aren't I? Healer, why do you take my blood? Who is that beside you with his head of lines? I can see a distant sun, dark and cold, shining in a black sky. Collected on the 3rd of Jasnah, 1172, 11 seconds pre-death. Subject was a Reshi Kol trainer. Sample is of particular note." Kaladin is sitting in the corner of the wagon cage, the wind spren asking him why he doesn't cry. Every morning, the slaves are let out and allowed to walk around. Then they got in the wagon and sat there for the rest of the day. They're fed 3 times a day, and they get 1 ladle of water a day. The Windspren flies close to Kaladin, and he's never seen one look so curious. She says that the others cry at night, but he doesn't. He tells her that he doesn't see the point in crying, it won't change anything. She asks him why do men cry, and he tells her to ask the Almighty. He kind of looks around at the environment for a while, and the only thing really of note here is he says that weather and seasons are unpredictable. You never knew how long they would go on, though typically each would last a few weeks. So again, very different from our world.
Mm-hmm.
The wagons don't stop for afternoon food today. The wagons finally stop, and Bluth and Tag begin to argue with Tavlakiv while looking at a piece of paper. So Bluth and Tag, if you don't remember, are Tavlakiv's like mercenary assistants, and Tavlakiv is the slave master. Kaladin taunts Tavlakiv, asking if they're lost, telling him to ask the Almighty for help, that the Almighty has a special place for slavers in damnation. And the rest of the slaves move away from him. Tavlakiv asks if Kaladin knew anything about the area, as Alethi armies moved through it often, and he shows Kaladin the map. Kaladin takes the map, and without looking at it, rips it in 2.
Oh.
Then he shreds it into 100 pieces. "Happy Middlefest, you bastards," Kaladin said as the flakes of paper fluttered around them.
Someone's desperate to die.
Oh, yeah, maybe not your smartest move, huh?
Desperate to die.
Tavlakiv tries to get the 2 mercenaries to punish Kaladin, but they just kind of look at Kaladin, and they're like, yeah, no, we're not messing with him.
Good choice.
Yeah. Tvlakv offers to give Kaladin an extra meal each day if he gives the man instructions. And Kaladin tells, Kaladin's like, all right, first we need to find a cliff. And Tvlakv says, okay, will that give you like a good vantage point? And Kaladin says, no, it's going to give me something to throw you off of. Tvlakv tells Kaladin that his hatred is good. It makes him strong and makes him sell for much more. But Kaladin will not be able to get vengeance on Tvlakv unless they get to market. Tvlakv will never let Kaladin escape, but perhaps another master would. Kaladin tells Tvlakv that he doesn't want vengeance. The Windspren comes back after she'd flown off to inspect some of the nearby shrubs, and then she begins to inspect Tvlakv's face, but he couldn't see her. Kaladin tells Tvlakv that vengeance doesn't work. He'd learned that years ago. Tvlakv says that Kaladin can't be more than 18. Kaladin mentions he's close, he's 19, and had joined Amaram's army 4 years ago. So Kaladin joined the army at 15.
Ugh.
Tvlakv tells Kaladin that he's still young, he could live past his time as a slave, pay off his price, or convince a master to give him freedom. Kaladin says that he's tried to escape 10 times, it's not going to happen. Tvlakv essentially tells him there's hope for the future, but Kaladin doesn't care. He's given up. Tvlakv says that if Kaladin could get free, he could get vengeance on Amaram. I'll find him, Kaladin thought. I'll gut him with my own hands. I'll twist his head right off his neck. Tvlakv can see the anger in Kaladin at the mention of Amaram, and says that Kaladin does thirst for vengeance. Kaladin asks Tvlakv how he knew about Amaram, and Tvlakv says that slavers talk. Kaladin says that he didn't get his brand for deserting, and Tvlakv says that they must pretend. Men guilty of high crimes, they do not sell so well. With that shash glyph on your head, it will be difficult enough to get a good price for you. If I cannot sell you, then you will not wish for that status. So we will play a game together. I will say you are a deserter, and you will say nothing. It's an easy game, I think. Kaladin says that's illegal, and Tvlakv says that they're not in Alethkar. There's no law here. He also says that desertion was the official reason for Kaladin's slavery, so if he said otherwise, he'd only get a reputation for lying. So, Kaladin says that he was put into slavery for killing a Light Eyes, but when he was actually put into slavery, the official reason that was given was that he deserted the army. Kaladin says that it would be worth it to get a reputation for lying, just to upset Tvlakv. Tvlakv asks about directions again, and Kaladin tells him that honestly he'd never been this way. Tvlakv decides to just go from memory. Later on, they almost missed getting ready for a high storm. The map that Kaladin had torn up had a list of dates for upcoming high storms that had been sold to Tvlakv by a storm warden. The storms could be predicted mathematically. Kaladin's father had made a hobby of it. The wagon was getting battered by the storm. The slaves huddled together for warmth except for Kaladin. Kaladin wasn't worried about the things said to walk the high storms, but the storm itself. He was worried a flying boulder could crush Tvlakv's shelter. So yeah, the storms are powerful enough that they pick up boulders from the ground and send them flying around. The slaves would die a slow death of starvation if that happened. The wind felt alive to Kaladin. He wondered if Windspren were attracted to wind or if they were the wind. The storm started to settle down, and Bluth undid the walls around the wagons, letting the rain in and washing the slaves. Kaladin says it's a little early to be opening the walls, and Bluth tells him that Tvlakv wanted them to be extra clean today. Kaladin wondered if they were nearing their destination. Kaladin inspected the wagon's surroundings and said that the land was most alive following a high storm. Plants and creatures left their hiding places. The hills around them had become uneven rock formations as they traveled, and within minutes the wagons were rolling again. The Windspren returned. She'd gone out during the storm, but had come back as always. Kaladin tells her that he saw others of her kind and asks her if she wanted to go with them. She tells him that she likes it here. Kaladin thinks that he doesn't mind her presence, as she'd stopped playing as many pranks on him. The Windspren tells him that there are other people nearby. She points to the east and says there are lots and lots of people in that direction. Kaladin saw smoke rising in the distance. He wondered if they were from chimneys. Then he wondered why he cared at all. He was a slave. It didn't matter where he was still a slave. The wagons climbed to the side of a hill, and Kaladin saw their destination. Not a city, but an enormous army encampment. 10 masses of soldiers camped in large crater-like formations, like broken eggshells. 1,000 banners with 1,000 different insignias flew in the air. Most of the troops were housed in large stone barracks, which meant that there were soul casters. That encampment directly ahead of them flew a banner Kaladin had seen in books. Deep blue with white glyphs, coke and linel, stylized and painted as a sword standing before a crown. House Kholin, the king's house. Beyond the armies, the landscape was as he'd heard it described in a dozen different stories detailing the king's campaign against the Parshendi betrayers. It was an enormous plain of rock, so wide he couldn't see the other side. It was split by sheer chasms, crevices 20 or 30 feet wide. They were so deep that they disappeared into darkness and formed a jagged mosaic of uneven plateaus. The expansive plain looked like a platter that had been broken, its pieces then reassembled with small gaps between the fragments. The shattered plains. Kaladin had spent years trying to get here. That's what Tien had wanted in the end, to come here and fight in the king's army. This place would be subject to Alethi law and rules. The other slaves got excited at the idea of the shattered plains. They hoped that the king's army would treat them better. Alethi law required that slaves got paid. Not a lot, less than a non-slave was paid, which was already less than a full citizen was paid, but they still required that they were paid. Only Ardents, who couldn't own anything anyway, and Parshmen didn't have to be paid. A slave could apply his earnings to his debt and theoretically buy his freedom. Kaladin didn't believe it was truly possible, though. His previous masters had always found ways to cheat him from his wages, charging him for his housing and his food. He thought all Light Eyes were like that. He'd named a couple of Light Eyes that he'd known: Rashon, Amaram, Katarutam. Every Light Eyes that Kaladin had known had shown themselves to be deeply corrupted. They were like rotting corpses clothed in beautiful silk. The others spoke of justice, but Kaladin didn't believe there was such a thing as justice. He let himself wonder, though. That was the king's army, the armies of all 10 high princes, come to fulfill the vengeance pact. If there was one thing he still let himself long for, it was the chance to hold a spear, to fight again, to try and find his way back to the man he had been, a man who had cared. If he would find that anywhere, he'd find it here. And that is the end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is titled Heretic, and we have Shallan's symbol again. The epigraph for this chapter is, I have seen the end and have heard it named, the night of sorrows, the true desolation, the Everstorm. Collected on the 1st of Nans, 1172, 15 seconds pre-death. Subject was a dark-eyed youth of unknown origin. Shallan had not expected Jasnah Kholin to be so beautiful. Shallan had expected Jasnah to be an ugly spinster, a heretic well into her mid-30s and still unmarried. Jasnah was talking to a man in robes of orange and white, the Kharbrantian royal colors. She turned to Shallan, then turned back to her conversation. So, Shallan takes some time to note Jasnah's, let's say, physical features. And this is when I'm going to note, which I think is one of the funniest aspects of, Shallan's character, which is that Shallan is bisexual. But
Ooh.
Brandon Sanderson, when he was writing The Way of Kings, did not know that Shallan was bisexual. He wrote Shallan as bisexual subconsciously, and then after the first book came out, other people were like, hey, is Shallan bisexual? And he went, oh, she is, isn't she? I didn't realize that I'd written her that way until after the fact. So, Shallan is bisexual, but he had not done it on purpose. Yeah, I think that's very fun. It is one of the fun facts of the series that is maybe one of my favorites. I love it.
Represent. I like her even more.
Yes, I love Shallan. Shallan has at times some of my least favorite storylines and at sometimes some of my favorite. Shallan is a great character. On her free hand, Jasnah wore a soul caster. It was 2 rings and a bracelet connected by several chains, holding a triangular group of gemstones across the back of the hand. Shallan tried to get a better look at the soul caster. She says that it looks identical to the one her and her brothers had found in her father's coat. Jasnah and the man in robes walked over to Shallan. Shallan becomes nervous and catches the end of their conversation. Jasnah is telling the robed man that this action might prompt an unfavorable reaction from the devotaries. The man told her that he understood. He was an elderly man with a white beard and pale gray eyes. He had an open, kindly face that seemed very concerned. Shallan realizes that this is the king of Kharbranth, Taravangian. Jasnah tells the king that the Ardents have much sway in Kharbranth, and the king tells her, don't worry, I've also got some pretty good sway. Jasnah tells him that his terms are agreeable, and she'll follow him to the location to see what she can do. She excuses herself as they walk, as she has someone else to attend to, and she motions for Shallan to join them. The king deferred to Jasnah, Carburanth was just one city, while Alethkar was one of the world's most powerful kingdoms. An Alethi princess outranked a Carbrantian king. Shallan approaches Jasnah, and the two of them follow behind the king. She introduces herself and apologizes for not meeting Jasnah in Dumadari, and Jasnah waves it off, telling Shallan it wasn't her fault. She didn't expect that Shallan would make it in time, but was unsure where Jasnah would be after leaving Dumadari. Some of Shallan's anxiety dissipated, as it became clear that Jasnah was not angry at her for being late. Jasnah complimented Shallan on her tenacity, and said most gave up chasing after the first few stops, and Shallan started to wonder if this had all been some sort of test. Jasnah says that she might actually allow Shallan to petition for her place as her ward, and Shallan goes, "Hold on a second, I already petitioned you to be your ward in the letter I sent you." Jasnah says, Jasnah tells her that she gave Shallan leave to meet her. She did not promise to take Shallan on. She doesn't have the tolerance or time to train a ward currently, but Shallan traveled far, so Jasnah will consider it. Jasnah asks Shallan how extensive her education is, and Shallan tells her that it is extensive in some places and extensively lacking in others. Jasnah decides to do an evaluation, and she tells her to answer truthfully, as she will know if she's lying. So then she asks her what her skill in music is, and Shallan says that she has a good ear and is trained with a couple instruments, and she knows most historical ballads by heart. Jasnah asks her to sing a refrain from a song, and Shallan does so, embarrassed. Jasnah asks her about her skill with languages. Shallan says that she can speak Alethi, has a passable reading knowledge of Thaylen, and good spoken Azish. She can make herself understand Ensile, but not read it. Writing, Jasnah asked, "I know all of the major, minor, and topical glyphs and can paint them calligraphically. She can draw glyphs." Jasnah says, "So can most children." Shallan replies, "The glyph words that I paint are regarded by those who know me as quite impressive." "Glyph words," Jasnah asked. "I had reason to believe you wanted to be a scholar, not a purveyor of superstitious nonsense." Shallan tells Jasnah that she's kept a journal since childhood. "Congratulations," Jasnah said. "Should I need someone to write a treatise on their stuffed pony or give an account of an interesting pebble they discovered, I shall send for you. Is there nothing you can offer that shows you have true skill?" Shallan points out that she sent Jasnah a letter good enough to convince Jasnah to meet with her, and Jasnah says this is a good point, and it took Shallan long enough to make it. She asks how her skill is with logics and its related arts. Shallan is accomplished in mathematics and has read the complete works of Tormas, Nishan, Niali the Just, and Nohadon. Jasnah asks her if she's read Placini. Shallan has no idea who that is and is like, I have not read any of those people. I have not read that person. And then Jasnah just starts to rattle off a bunch of names. Gabrathan, Ystara, Manalain, Siasisk, Shuaka, daughter, Haswith. Shallan shakes her head no to all of them and states that the last name was Shin, and she wondered if the Shin even had logic masters. Jasnah asks her about her skill with history. Shallan says that she had a suitable history tutor. She'd read the entire set of Barlesha Lan's topics. Jasnah dismisses the books named as being barely worth the time spent scribing them, a popular survey of historical events at best. Shallan apologizes and Jasnah tells her that this is an embarrassing hole. History is the most important of the literary subarts. Shallan tells her that her circumstances are unusual, and Jasnah says that ignorance is hardly unusual. "The longer I live, the more I come to realize that it is the natural state of the human mind. There are many who will strive to defend its sanctity and then expect you to be impressed with their efforts." Shallan thought that Jasnah had unreasonable expectations. She was flustered, walking silently alongside Jasnah. Jasnah moves on to science. Shallan says she has a reasonable foundation of the sciences. She can speak with skill about geography, geology, physics, and chemistry. She's made a particular study of biology and botany. But if you expect me to be able to solve Fabrasian's conundrum with the wave of my hand, I suspect you shall be disappointed. Jasnah says, "Have I not a right to make reasonable demands of my potential students, Miss Devar?" And Shallan says, "Reasonable. Your demands are about as reasonable as the ones made of the 10 heralds on the proving day. With all due respect, Brightness, you seem to want potential wards to be master scholars already. I may be able to find a pair of 80-year-old ardents in the city who might fit your requirements. They could interview for the position, though they may have trouble hearing well enough to answer your questions." Jasnah asks her if she talks to her parents that way, and Shallan apologizes, saying that she shouldn't have said that. Jasnah asks how Shallan's mother considered her ready for wardship, and Shallan tells her that her mother passed away when she was just a child. Jasnah then points out that her father soon be married to Melise Gevelmar. Shallan found the fact that Jasnah knew the name of her stepmother to be odd. She tells Jasnah that her stepmother passed away recently. Shallan had taken the initiative to appeal to Jasnah herself. Jasnah gives her condolences and tells Shallan she should be with her father, seeing to his estates and comforting him rather than wasting her time. Shallan says her father has no need for her, but she has great need for Jasnah. If ignorance galls you so much, can you in good conscience pass up the opportunity to rid me of mine? Jasnah tells her that she's the 12th young woman to ask for wardship that year. Shallan had thought more women would stay away from Jasnah because of her antagonism toward religion. They turned a corner to find a place where a large chunk of rock had fallen from the ceiling. A massive stone, taller than a man, had fallen into a doorway. Shallan thought she heard sounds on the other side. The king stepped up to the rock and spoke in a comforting voice. Jasnah asks when the cave-in happened, and the king tells her it was during the most recent high storm. He says it would take too long and would be too dangerous to try and cut their way in. Jasnah says that this will be very difficult and will probably cost her a very valuable focal stone. The king laments that they don't have a shard blade to use to cut the rock up, and Jasnah says that access to the Palladium is worth the cost. She tells them to send for wet rags and have the majority of the servants move down to the other end of the hallway, and tells the king that he probably also wants to wait there as well. The king says that he will stay. His Ardents object, but he says that he will not hide like a coward while his granddaughter is trapped. Shallan understood why he was anxious now. Jasnah didn't seem to care if the king risked his life or not. Jasnah didn't order Shallan away either. Servants handed out wet rags, and Jasnah refused one. The king and his bodyguards raised theirs, covering their mouth and nose. They passed rags into the blocked-off room for the ones inside. Jasnah asks Shallan how she would find out the mass of the stone. Shallan says that his majesty probably already had it calculated. The king gives the weight, and Jasnah approves of Shallan's answer. A scholar knows not to waste time rediscovering information already known. It's a lesson I sometimes forget, and Shallan swells with pride at the praise. Shallan held up her free hand, the one with the soul caster. Shallan had never seen soul casting done up close. The Ardents were very secretive about their fabrials. She hadn't even known her father had one until she found it on his corpse. His no longer worked and was one of the main reasons she was here. The gemstones in Jasnah's soulcaster were enormous. Jasnah closed her eyes, pressing her hand against the fallen boulder. She raised her head, inhaling slowly. The stones on the back of her hand began to glow more fiercely, the smoke stone in particular growing so bright it was difficult to look at. Shallan held her breath. The only thing she dared to do was blink, committing the scene to memory. For a long, extended moment, nothing happened. And then briefly, Shallan heard a sound. A low thrumming like a distant group of voices humming together a single pure note. Jasnah's hand sank into the rock. The stone vanished. A burst of dense black smoke exploded into the hallway, enough to blind Shallan. Shallan hastily raised the wet rag to her face, dropping to her knees. She shut her eyes tightly as they began to water, and she held her breath. She opened her eyes and found the king and his bodyguards huddled against the wall beside her. Jasnah had used the soulcaster to transform the boulder into smoke, and since smoke was far less dense than stone, the change had pushed the smoke away in an explosive outburst. 9 out of 10 soulcasters could do few limited transformations, creating water or grain from stone, forming bland, single-roomed rock buildings out of air or cloth. A greater one like Jasnah's could do any transformation. How it must grate on the Ardents that such a powerful, holy relic was in the hands of someone outside the Ardentia, and a heretic no less. Shallan stumbled to her feet. She swallowed, her ears popping as the hallway's pressure returned to normal. The king rushed into the now accessible room. A small girl sat on the side, the king pulled her into his arms. Jasnah opened her eyes, blinking as if momentarily confused by her location. She took a deep breath and didn't cough. Indeed, she actually smiled, as if enjoying the scent of the smoke. Jasnah turns to Shallan and tells her that she won't like what Jasnah has to say. Shallan points out that Jasnah hasn't finished her test yet. Jasnah seems confused at this. Shallan says that she never asked about the feminine arts. Jasnah says that she has no use for those. Shallan says that many considered the visual arts the most refined of them all, and she'd brought her portfolio to show to Jasnah. Jasnah says the visual arts are frivolity. I have weighed the facts, child, and I cannot accept you. I'm sorry. Jasnah turns to the king and asks him to go to the Palladium. The king tells her they're about to have a feast, but Jasnah insists that she doesn't have time. The king offers to take her personally, he offers to take her personally, and they continue to talk as he leads her down the hallway. Shallan wanted to cry. 6 months of chasing for this. That was what she'd have done if she'd have been the same child she was 6 months ago. She had changed. If she failed, House Devar would fall. She was not going to give up until Jasnah was forced to have her dragged out in chains. Her step surprisingly firm, she walked in the direction Jasnah had gone. 6 months ago, she had explained a desperate plan to her brothers. She would apprentice herself to Jasnah Kholin, scholar, heretic. Not for the education, not for the prestige, but in order to learn where she kept her soulcaster. And then, Shallan would steal it. Alright, before we get into the next chapter, I have another image for you. So I'm going to send this to you, and have you describe to me what it is. What do you see?
I see text that is very hard to read.
I've got that written down. I'll read it. But it's another map.
I need glasses, Shawn.
Well, the text reads, charcoal rubbing of a map of Sadius's war camp as used by a common spearman. It was scratched on the back of a palm-sized Kremling shell. Rubbing labeled in ink by an anonymous Alethi scholar circa 1173. So the map shows the path to the Shattered Plains. It calls out an area called as the known as the Honor Chasm.
Okay.
It shows off barracks and the carpentry area, a staging area. But yeah, this is a map of Sadius's war camp at the Shattered Plains.
Okay.
Chapter 6 is titled Bridge 4, and again, we have Kaladin's symbol, so we're back to Kaladin. The epigraph for this chapter is, I'm cold. Mother, I'm cold. Mother, why can I still hear the rain? Will it stop? Collected on Veveshes, 1172, 32 seconds pre-death. Subject was a light-eyed female child, approximately 6 years old. Tvlakiv let the slaves out of their wagons. They had made it to the army. The army had been here for nearly 6 years, ever since the old king's death. The soldiers didn't look disciplined. They roamed the camp in packs, their coats undone, pointing and laughing at the slaves. This was the army of a high prince, the elite force that fought for Alethkar's honor. This was what Kaladin had aspired to join. The slaves lined up. The slave that had talked to Kaladin about escaping stood next to him. He said this wouldn't be that bad. They'd be cleaning latrines or maintaining roads. Kaladin hoped to join the army. Tvlakiv spoke to an important light-eyed woman. Kaladin compared her to a woman named Laurel that he knew. Tvlakiv tried to boast, but she shut him up immediately. The woman was unimpressed. She complained about paying 2 emerald bromes per slave, and Tvlakiv offers to drop it to 1.5. She says she has no use for the slaves, and he says that he could always just go to one of the other high princes. She offers 1.25 and decides she can have them cut timber. She stops before Kaladin, impressed by him. Tvlakiv tries to speak, but the woman silences him. She orders Kaladin to remove his shirt, and he considers spitting on her before deciding that would probably be a bad idea. He removed his shirt, and the woman noted the large number of scars. She asks if he was a military man, and he says yes. She asks if he'd been a mercenary, and he says that he had been in Amaram's army, a citizen of the Second Non. Tvlakiv tried to interrupt him, and the woman silenced him again. She pushed aside Kaladin's hair and inspected the glyphs on his forehead. She says that where she's from, slaves with Shosh glyphs are executed. Kaladin says they are fortunate. She asks how he ended up a slave, and he tells her he killed someone, preparing to lie to her. He tells her he got drunk and made mistakes. He asks her to let him in the army, to let him fight again. Tvlakiv interrupts at this point and tells her that Kaladin was lying. He was a deserter. Kaladin raised his hands towards Tvlakiv, and someone cracked him across the back, sending him to his knees. Kaladin asked her to give him a chance, but she silenced him. Tvlakiv tells the woman Kaladin is known to lead rebellions against his masters. He couldn't be trusted with a spear. Kaladin considered grabbing a spear and spending his last moments ramming it through Tvlakiv. Kaladin thought he should never have torn up that map. The woman says she'll take some of the men as bridgemen. Tvlakiv whispered to Kaladin that they would have blamed Tvlakiv if Kaladin had done something and Tvlakiv hadn't warned them. He apologizes. Kaladin settled back into line, resigned. They'd taken everything from him. They couldn't take any more. Tvlakiv and the woman made a deal for the slaves. Kaladin and 9 other are sent to the bridge crews. The woman says, tell Lamarol and Gaz that the tall one is to be given special treatment. The soldiers led Kaladin and the other men away. Kaladin noticed the banners flying above the camp, a yellow glyph pair in the shape of a tower and a hammer on a field of deep green, the banner of High Prince Sadeas, the ruler of Kaladin's home. Even the soldiers on duty lounged idly. The streets were littered with trash. Civilians roamed the streets. The place was half city, half war camp. Parshmen worked the camp as well, surprising Kaladin. They'd brought Parshmen while they were fighting other Parshmen. They arrived at the bridgemen's barracks. The men here weren't much better than the slaves. The soldiers escorting them brought them to a man named Gaz. Gaz was missing one eye, but didn't bother with an eye patch. He was a sergeant. So he's just got his whole ass empty eye socket showing.
Ew.
Yeah. Gaz complains about the state of them, saying they'll barely stop an arrow. One of the soldiers shoved Kaladin forward and said, "Brightness Hashal said to do something special with this one. The rest are up to you." Then the soldiers walk away. Kaladin tells Gaz that he has military training, and Gaz tells him he doesn't care. Kaladin tries to speak again, but Gaz cuts him off, asking if he was supposed to be impressed that Kaladin had served under some unimportant landlord. Gaz tells Kaladin he'll have to settle for joining the Bridgemen and starts to call him lordship, as if it's like derogatory. Kaladin's windspren flew down and inspected Gaz. She closed one of her eyes and imitated him. Seeing her made Kaladin smile, which Gaz took poorly. He stepped forward but was interrupted by the sounds of horns. Gaz cursed and yelled at the bridgemen to get up. They all scrambled to their feet, wearing sandals instead of boots. Gaz calls the Kaladin lordship again and tells him he's in Bridge 4, pointing at a group of bridgemen. He tells the slaves to get moving, or he'll see them strung up by their feet. Kaladin ran over to the group of bridgemen. It was one of many teams. There were near 50 barracks and about 20 or 30 men each. They were nearly as many bridgemen alone as Amaram's entire army. Kaladin's team ran towards a giant wooden bridge, 30 feet long, 8 feet wide. It sloped at the front and back and had no railings. There were about 40 or 50 bridges. 20 crews had lined up. Gaz put on a wooden shield and held a mace, but there was nothing for the bridgemen. He approaches Bridge 4 and asks them where their bridge leader is. They tell him he tossed himself down the honor chasm last night.
Oh.
Gaz says, "Can't you keep a bridge leader for even a week? Storm it. Line up. I'll run near you. Listen to my commands. We'll sort out another bridge leader after we see who survives." He tells Kaladin to get to the back and yells at the men to get moving. They lifted the bridge and held it up. There were spots 5 men across, 3 under the bridge, and 2 on each side, and 8 deep. Bridge 4 didn't have that many men. They rested the bridge down on their shoulders. The other men had pads on their shoulders to cushion the weight, but Kaladin hadn't been given a vest. He couldn't see a thing from under the bridge. The crew started jogging. They marched down towards the shattered plain, his shoulders already starting to bleed. A man next to Kaladin calls him a poor fool, tells him he shouldn't have insulted Gaz, that he could have run in an outside row. Kaladin couldn't respond. He was gasping for breath. "Breathe in and out deeply," said the muffled voice. "Focus on the steps. Count them. It helps." Kaladin followed the advice. Behind them, Kaladin could hear an army following. The ground was broken and uneven. It caused Kaladin to trip. That explained why they didn't use wheels. It was faster to carry the bridges. Soon, his feet were jagged and battered. He hadn't even been given shoes. He would continue, and he would survive. They crossed one of the permanent bridges, and Gaz yelled at them to keep moving. Blood ran down Kaladin's shoulders. They ran for an hour. He couldn't feel his feet. If he stopped, he'd be beaten. He was too exhausted to count his steps, but he didn't stop running. Finally, Gaz called for them to stop. They lifted the bridge and dropped it to the ground. Then they pushed it across one of the chasms. Kaladin looked at the army behind them, 2,000 men in forest green and pure white. They finished putting the bridge in place, and Kaladin collapsed to the ground as the army crossed. The other men did the same, and Gaz walked among them, calling them worthless. Kaladin wanted to just lie there, but he would cramp up if he did. That training, it belonged to another man, from another time, but while Kaladin might not be him any longer, he could still heed him. Kaladin rose to his feet. Gaz watched the army crossing with envy, and Kaladin's windspren flew around Gaz's head. Kaladin felt jealousy. Gaz noticed Kaladin and scowled. The man who had given Kaladin advice earlier tells him that Gaz is wondering why Kaladin isn't lying down. The man was older with graying hair. Kaladin ripped some of his clothing and bound his feet and shoulders. The last of the army crossed the bridge, followed by a man in red shard plate. This shard plate looked special to Kaladin from others he'd seen. He asked if that man was the king, and the older man said they could only wish. If it had been the king, that would mean that they were in Bright Lord Dalinar's army. Kaladin asked if that was the king's uncle. The older man said, "Aye, the best of men, the most honorable shard-bearer in the king's army. They say he's never broken his word." The older man tells Kaladin that Dalinar doesn't even use bridge crews like these. Gaz tells them to get to their feet, and Kaladin says he'll be glad to go back, but the man says they aren't nearly at their destination, that arriving at the destination was the worst part. They lifted the bridge, jogged across the plateau, lowered it, pushed it into place, and rested as the army crossed. They did this 12 times. If they didn't place their bridge quickly enough, they'd be whipped when they got back. Okay, so my alarm's about to go off, but I'm gonna pause it, and I'm gonna get to a stopping point that's soon, because I got a good place to stop. What did I say? What did I say last? I said that arriving at the destination was the worst part. Gaz gave orders, cursing the bridgemen, kicking them when they moved too slowly, never doing any real work. Kaladin hated him. Gaz had sent Kaladin out without shoes or a vest. Kaladin wouldn't be able to walk in the morning. Gaz had risked the mission by losing a carrier, for a grudge. Kaladin used his hatred of Gaz to sustain him. Kaladin wondered why they were even doing this. He entered a trance, moving the bridge. Gaz called for them to switch. The troops were forming ranks, anticipation spren began to rise from the ground. Gaz grabbed Kaladin and pushed him to the front of the bridge. Kaladin could see out from the front of the bridge. The bridgeman from the front had been moved to the back and vice versa. The old man Kaladin had been running with at the back was now at the front with him. Kaladin didn't ask the point of it. He liked the front. He could see better. He had fresh air from the hole. Mango, the front of the bridge is nice.
Front of the bridge is where you're more likely to get killed.
Well, about that. Talanalet Elin, bearer of all agonies, said the man to his right, voice horrified. It's gonna be a bad one. They're already lined up. Oh, it's gonna be a bad one. Kaladin looked at the approaching chasm. On the other side of the rift stood a rank of men with marbled crimson and black skin. They were wearing a strange rusty orange armor that covered their forearms, chests, heads, and legs. The Parshendi. Some wore dark red and black beards tied with bits of rocks, while others were clean-shaven. They held bows, arrows knocked, the bridges charged. The men, screaming as they ran toward death. And I think we'll leave it there for now. Let's talk about Kaladin for a little bit. Those slaves were pretty sure they were going to be in a better place in the army, huh?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Slaves are not in a better place anywhere other than not being slaves.
Yes. But, the first time I read this, the idea of bridgemen is so horrifying. Like, it's just, oh man. I can't imagine just running for hours like that. It's awful.
I'm surprised they don't collapse within minutes.
Yeah. I think that's the only upside of having so many of them, right? Is that you're sharing the weight with others, but
yeah, but I mean, even if you're
then,
not carrying anything, running for more than 10 minutes, you're gonna be ready to pass out.
I guess the fear of beatings keeps them going, but like Kaladin says, immediately upon stopping, like, because their whole thing is they run to the edge of a chasm, they set the bridge down, they let the army cross, and then they pick it back up and they run to the next edge of the chasm. He says that whenever they set the bridge down, everybody just immediately collapses onto the ground and just lies there until the army finishes crossing so that they can pick it back up. So, like...
But he knows better than to collapse on the ground because it'll make him cramp.
Yes. You noted that Kaladin might have a death wish.
Yep.
Yeah. Kaladin doesn't get a whole lot this chapter.
Depressed.
Yeah. I think they do a really good job, or Sanderson does a really good job with him being like, he'll be like, oh, I wonder if those are chimneys, and then he'll immediately go, oh, who cares if it's even chimneys? Like, his just general hopelessness, I think, is very well depicts his depression, but I think what makes Kaladin such a compelling character is his strength besides that. Like they talk about, he's like, I could just collapse right now. Like, it doesn't matter, right? But he still goes on anyways.
Yeah. And
I find that very inspiring in a character.
He carries on out of pure spite.
Yeah. especially with Gaz. What do you think of Gaz, by the way? What a colorful character, huh? What an eyeless fuck.
Ew.
I hate the idea that he doesn't even wear
an eye patch.
It's so, I hate that. I hate it so much.
Gross. Not having an eye is not gross, but not covering up your open eye socket, that is gross.
I do like the note of Kaladin's Windspren just kind of
mocking him.
Yeah,
I love that. I like the Windspren. She's cute.
She's very great. I love her as well. Shallan. So what we went through today, really, a lot of that is giving explanation for what Shallan's whole deal was, or deal is. And I think that when I first read this, I liked Shallan as a character, but I wasn't really hooked on her storyline until that final line that I read from her chapter, which is that she's there to steal the Soulcaster from Jasnah.
She doesn't give a fuck about, learning shit from her. She just wants the bracelet thing.
Yeah. We learned some interesting things, and the mystery of Shallan, I think, starts to come together now, where she says her dad is dead, but they're not going to tell anyone that he's dead. And she also says that they found a broken Soulcaster on her dad's corpse. That he had one. Which, she also says that Jasnah having a Soulcaster at all, as she's not a part of the Ardentia, is... And I'll just say the Ardentia, the Ardents, that's the church. Those are the priests. That's their name for the Church of the Priests. So Jasnah having one is a big deal.
And her father also had one, so...
Yes.
It's not
which
just
would
one.
Also be weird. Yeah. It's weird that her father also had one.
Yeah.
As he was not a member of the church. Or he wasn't like a priest. What do you think? I know you like Shallan. I think you like Kaladin because of his strength of pure spite, and he's very relatable.
Yeah. We
got a little bit of Jasnah. What do you think of Jasnah?
Not much.
Not much.
She's just yeah, I don't give a fuck about what you know. If you're not the most intelligent person in the world, I don't care. Go away.
She has very high standards.
She's a bitch.
Yeah, she is a bitch. And rereading this, I was like, oh man, God. Jasnah is one of my favorite characters in the books. Jasnah is, whenever I talk about Sanderson, I talk about how, people that don't know, Sanderson is Mormon.
Yeah, yeah.
He does a fantastic job, not just here, but in his other works as well, portraying characters that are atheist.
Characters that are not straight.
Yeah, characters that are not straight. Although he's kind of just starting to... He doesn't do that as much. He's done the atheist thing more than he's done the characters of different sexuality. But regardless, we only see Jasnah from Shallan's point of view in here, and she's also just met her. So Shallan, as a devout woman, has a very a certain view of Jasnah, as she is a heretic that openly denounces religion. But I think Jasnah is one of the most well-written atheist characters that I've ever read in a book, especially for somebody like Sanderson, who is very religious. So coming from somebody like that, I'm very impressed, and I'm excited for you to see more of Jasnah. The only other thing I will note besides that is that I've been using the word Soulcaster a lot, and you finally got to see what a Soulcaster does.
It does transformations, so it can turn stuff into other stuff. It can turn a rock into smoke.
And that's one of the also interesting things about Sanderson is he does hard magic systems where there are the magic is based in physics and there are rules. So
is
when
it the law of equivalent exchange from Full Metal Alchemist? or something.
I've never, I don't know anything about Fullmetal Alchemist.
Okay, well,
sure.
I barely know anything either, except for Edward Elric lost an arm and a leg. There's a genocide, and I know that the explanation of the magic system is said as the intro of every single episode in the entire series.
Oh, I guess you'll never forget that, huh?
But it's just like, you can't make stuff out of nowhere. You have to have all the exact ingredients to do what you want. Like, you can't create matter out of nothing, and you can't just uncreate matter. So you have to turn it into something else. So
yeah. And it's interesting because, like, what I really like about this scene, especially on reread, is that when Jasnah's soul casts the rock into smoke, the smoke needs to fill the same area. And since, like, it's less dense, it's pretty much like a little explosion when it transforms. And I think that's neat. And that's a good example, I think, of the physics behind Sanderson's magic. Yes?
Oh, I was just like, yay, physics.
Yay, physics.
I don't really understand total physics, but, like...
Yeah, no, me too.
When things are based on physics, it's like, yeah, that makes sense.
I will say, I think Sanderson does a good job, right, with the physics stuff, with making it approachable and enjoyable, and not too much. That being said, the fourth book is the first time I was ever reading a Sanderson book, and the physics started to get a little bit too much. Where I was like, okay, not even just the physics, but the science of the entire... Oh, he goes into the science a lot in book 4, and I would argue a little bit too much.
Well, we'll see that if we get to it.
Yeah, in fucking 10 years if we get to it.
Can you imagine doing this in 10 years?
I mean, look, I fucking love this shit, okay? But yeah, outside of that, I don't have anything else to bring up. I don't know if you have anything besides what we've talked about.
No. Not really.
Okay. I will say, you remember how earlier I messaged you and I was like, man, I didn't have time to take notes. Thankfully, I think we have like 2 sessions left of notes.
You said 2 sessions left before we started.
Yeah. Remember, yeah, that's what I was saying. That I think I would have 2 recordings of notes left.
Yeah.
I have a page and a half of notes left.
Yeah, so you probably need to go take some more notes.
Oh, I do. I will say now, and actually I'm just telling Mango this for the first time now. I should have mentioned it earlier. No episode next week. I'm out of town when we normally record. I'm actually going to be leaving for the airport when we normally record. So no episode next week, but we'll be back the week after that. But yeah, Mango, where can people find you online?
Twitch at Mango Asteroid. I don't stream very often, but I'm hoping to do streaming more often in the future once I get back into the groove of it. That's pretty much the only social thing I use. So, just that. Where can they find you, Shawn?
Well, they can find me on Twitter at Shawn_AFK. Also, if you guys want to follow this show, there is a Twitter account that I'm posting on. I'm posting the episodes and the art that we talk about in the episodes on there. That is at SpeakStormlight on Twitter. We're on Anchor at anchor.fm/speakthewords. That is where we host the podcast. We are on a bunch of different podcast platforms, including Spotify, Breaker, Google Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Radio Public. I think we're on Apple, but don't take my word for it. Besides that, I think that's everything that I need to plug. So, next time, Mango, we're gonna see the aftermath of this bridge run.
So many people are gonna die.
Oh yeah. So we're gonna see the aftermath of that, and also we're gonna learn the Windspren's name.
Ooh.
So look forward to that. We will see you guys next time.
Bye.